What do you see when you look at this stone? Flying saucer, a spaceman, a magic ritual going on of some sort? Well, what if I told you that this stone is one of thousands of stones so commonly found through all of central Mexico? There's actual businesses called jack detectors. They will take you on a 3 or 4 hour trek into the wilderness just to look for some of these stones. Now, this fact alone has led many outsiders who have seen some of these stones before to think that maybe they're fake. They've got to be a hoax, right, if people are making money off of this in Mexico. That brings us to Scott Wolter. He's a forensic geologist. He's also the host of America Unearthed. In other words, he's basically like the real life Indiana Jones. The thing you got to know about Scott Wolter is he has no qualms about calling out a hoax. In fact, on his show, America Unearthed, 2 hoaxers called him and his entire camera crew down to look at some stone carving, and he immediately, within 5 minutes of looking at it, knew exactly that it was a hoax, and that episode turned into him confronting them.
It's not real then?
Yep.
Wow.
It's a hoax.
I'll be darned.
So I got a question. Do you guys know anything about this?
So Scott Wolter had a handful of these stones with aliens carved into them, brought to him by one of his friends named Mark Russell, who's an artifact hunter by trade. Now, the thing you need to know about Mark Russell, Scott trusts this guy for his reputation of always only having genuine artifacts, meaning the fact that it was Mark Russell bringing this handful of stones to him, he had to take a second look and entertain the idea that maybe these might not be a hoax. And so Scott launched a 2-pronged investigation. The first part of the investigation is he was going to look at the stones that Mark brought to him, and then he was going to go down to Mexico himself, meet up with some jack detectors, and see what kind of stones that he may be able to find while on an expedition with some tour guides who do this every single day. Which brings us to part 1 of the investigation. They started looking at these stones under a microscope, and the first thing that Scott immediately noticed was that there was no signs of weathering, and this was immediately explained by the fact that Mark Russell had personally witnessed these stones being dug out of the ground.
Unfortunately, these things were found buried, right? So there really isn't any weathering for me to look at.
So the next thing they looked at was looking inside of the grooves. Was there any sign that maybe modern day tools were used to carve these depictions into this stone?
I mean, these lines, not only does the artwork look modern, it almost looks cartoonish in some cases.
And upon looking at it under a microscope, he did notice that a couple parts of this specific clay tablet did have some adhesive that was used to glue the eye and the mouth. If this is in fact adhesive, then you can have it sent to a lab to be carbon dated. Now, if you don't know what carbon dating is just basically taking any organic sample and measuring how much of the carbon-14 isotope is located within that, because depending on the isotope, you could guess very accurately how long ago this stone carving was created. And much to Scott's surprise, before Mark even brought these stones over, he had some of the adhesive scraped off the eyepiece, sent to a lab at the University of Arizona, and they dated it back to 7000 BC. That's about 9,000 years ago.
Which is like 5,000 years before any known culture in Mexico was even known to exist.
So Scott, being the academic he is, he was still a little skeptical. So what he wanted to do was scrape off some adhesive from a different part of the clay tablet and send it to his own independent lab to see if 2 different labs could come up with the same exact result from a carbon dating test. Unfortunately, this process would take a few weeks to complete. So in the meantime, that's when he went down to Mexico to meet up with the jack detectors.
I would like to go to that place and actually dig some out of the ground if we could, to see if the context where these pieces came from is legitimate.
So these jack detectors take Scott and his entire camera crew of people, and they lead him on a 6-hour trek through the jungles of Veracruz, Mexico, until they come upon a cave. And this cave has about 3 or 4 feet of clearance for people to walk into, and covering the entire floor of this cave are carvings directly in the ground. So Scott goes right to work, and the first thing he notices is, again, no signs of weathering. But these, unlike the tablets that he had seen in his lab, should have signs of weathering because they were exposed to the elements. But not wanting to immediately write off these jack detectors, Scott says, okay, well, do you guys have any of these stones that I can take a look at? So when they get back to the base camp, they show him 3 stones that they had found in that specific cave. So Scott looks under one of these under a microscope, and the first thing that Scott notices are these parallel lines traversing each of the grooves, and these lines look like they were formed by a modern day Dremel. And then even looking at the other 2 stones, the color of the stones, it's made of some clay that was completely different than the dirt from that cave. So he takes a step back, and something fishy immediately catches his eye. The letters UFO carved directly into this piece of clay.
I noticed the UFO, and I grabbed the field producer and I said, hey dude, look at this. He started to laugh. I said, do you want me to point that out on camera, or do you not want to embarrass these guys? And to their credit, they handled it really well. You know, they could have freaked out and gotten pissed, in part due to their reaction. I don't think they had anything to do with it. I think they found somebody else's practical joke. Clearly those things were weren't real.
But wanting to keep an open mind, Scott decided, okay, if these stones were not real, that does not mean that the ones that Mark Russell brought him to his original lab were fake as well. And if you even compare the two side by side, you can see that the ones that were fake with the UFO carved into it looks way less sophisticated than the actual ones brought to the lab. So let's go back to the clay tablet. After a few weeks, he finally got the lab results back, and much to Scott's surprise, the second carbon dating of this clay tablet came out to
9600 BP, which is before present, and I just think that's incredible.
Which almost exactly lines up with the first C14 test done by Mark Russell independently.
Having said that, I've tested many more of these artifacts. I'm getting some more big dates. It's consistent. So something's going on, but I'm not ready to get all wigged out on these things just yet.
Which brings me to recent updates that Scott Wolter has had on these stones. You see, I had the opportunity to interview Scott on my podcast that I had back in the day before I started this wonderful channel right here. One of the first things that I asked Scott about was his opinion on these stones. And he said, let's talk about the carbon dating.
I got pretty excited because I'll take it at face value, but that's not where it stops. You have to try to falsify to see if somebody could fake it. In other words, can we create an artifact with modern materials and still get those kinds of dates? You know what a woolly mammoth is, right? Those things were running around during the Ice Age. They have actually found mammoths preserved in ice that are that young. So could they have taken some of this bone or maybe some of the tusks, grind it up, mix it with a modern adhesive, and if we tested it, what kind of a date would we get?
The only problem with that theory, who would go through the lengths to go and find a woolly mammoth tusk, create an adhesive out of it, carve some aliens into a clay tablet, and then bury it underground in the remote desert of Mexico, hoping that someone would find it and actually get it carbon dated? All of those steps, all of that effort just to maybe have a hoax that maybe someone will find, which brings us to the actual hieroglyphs on all of these different symbols.
I have a lot of these artifacts here. If you have a second, I can run down and grab and I'll show you something that will blow you away. You ready? Hold on.
So he runs off, returns to the camera about 30 seconds later, and he brings up a bunch of different stones. And what he points out immediately is the pictures carved into the stone.
Look at the carvings. I want to show you the back. Look at the text. It's holding up a baby. But do you see the symbols?
Between the stones that he has alone, he's documented every hieroglyph that's fine carved into the background of each of these clay tablets, almost like a watermark.
I have documented and I've written them down, over 1,000 of these symbols. Not one repeats. Not one.
So then naturally, during this interview, I asked him, okay, well, if they don't repeat and it's probably 9,000 years old, then what are the symbols? What do they represent? And what he told me blew my mind.
This particular one probably has 100 symbols on it. They don't repeat, so it's not a language. It's not an alphabet. So what is it? What I think it could be is symbolic representation of telepathic communication.
What about those symbols connects to the telepathy conclusion?
Because I don't know what else it could be. It's not a language. It's not an alphabet.
So this is all assuming that they are legitimate.
Correct. But who the hell is going to go to the work to create every symbol is different. Not one is the same.
Scott Wolter, to this day, has not been able to disprove that these stones are in fact genuine.
I would think one of the major holes would be that there would be repeating symbols, because if it's a scammer or a hoax artist, there's going to be obvious lacks in their thinking.
They're going to screw up somewhere.
The fact that they're not repeating.
That's the part that blows my mind. And I did that work before we did any C14 testing on the glues.
And what's even more crazy, maybe even conspiratorial, the season after he revealed that these stones may in fact be real, his show didn't get canceled. It didn't even get discontinued. It just stopped. And in Scott Wolter's words, the reason why they stopped the show,
it was never canceled. We passed Ancient Aliens as the #1 show. And they said they're not renewing the show. And I said, why not? And you know what they said? They said the reason is your show's too smart for history.
And if you thought this story of these stones was mind-blowing, wait until you see this video right here of a breakaway civilization that has flying saucers in Antarctica.